Imagine standing at the foot of a towering mountain in the ancient world. Snow covers its distant peaks. Storm clouds gather around its summit. Entire civilizations look toward it with awe and fear. To most people today, Mount Hermon is simply a mountain on the northern border of Israel. But according to some of the oldest traditions connected to Genesis 6, this mountain became the setting for one of the most consequential acts of rebellion in human history. What if the story of the fallen angels was not merely about mysterious beings descending from heaven? What if it was connected to a specific location, a specific oath, and a specific rebellion that echoes throughout the entire Bible? And what if understanding this mountain helps explain Genesis 6, the Nephilim, the conquest of Canaan, the ministry of Jesus, and even the final victory described in Revelation? Stay until the very end, because we are going to explore what Scripture says, what ancient traditions claim, and why Mount Hermon became one of the most important locations in the supernatural worldview of the Bible. The story begins long before Mount Hermon enters the biblical narrative by name. To understand its significance, we must first understand how Scripture presents geography itself. Modern readers often think of mountains, rivers, and nations as merely physical places. But throughout the Bible, geography frequently carries theological meaning. Certain locations become meeting points between heaven and earth. Certain territories become associated with God's presence. Others become associated with rebellion, idolatry, and spiritual opposition. This is where Deuteronomy 32 becomes incredibly important. In Deuteronomy 32, Moses looks back on the history of the nations and says that when the Most High divided humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. While manuscript traditions differ, the Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint preserve readings that point toward heavenly beings being associated with the nations after Babel. Israel remains Yahweh's own inheritance, but the nations become connected to lesser spiritual rulers. This creates what many scholars call a cosmic geography. Human history is not unfolding in isolation. Spiritual realities stand behind earthly kingdoms. The nations are not merely political entities, they are part of a larger supernatural drama, stretching from Babel to Revelation. But here is where things become even more interesting. Before Deuteronomy 32, before Israel entered the Promised Land, before David ruled in Jerusalem, Genesis 6 introduces one of the most mysterious passages in Scripture. The text says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of humanity were beautiful and took wives for themselves. The result was the Nephilim, mighty men of old, men of renown." For centuries, readers have debated the identity of the sons of God. Yet throughout the Old Testament, the phrase consistently refers to heavenly beings. In Job 1 and Job 2, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord. In Job 38, they rejoice at creation itself. Ancient Jewish readers overwhelmingly understood Genesis 6 as describing a rebellion involving heavenly beings crossing boundaries established by God. And this is where Mount Hermon enters the story. Ancient traditions preserved during the Second Temple period connected the descent of these rebellious beings to Mount Hermon. According to those traditions, the Watchers gathered together and swore an oath before carrying out their rebellion. Whether every detail of those traditions is historically accurate is not the primary question. What matters is understanding why ancient readers associated this specific mountain with such a significant event. The name Hermon itself may be connected to concepts involving dedication, separation, or oath-taking. Ancient readers saw symbolism in the mountain. A place originally associated with heavenly authority became associated with heavenly rebellion. Think about the tragedy of that inversion. Throughout Scripture, mountains often function as sacred meeting places. Eden appears connected to mountain imagery in Ezekiel 28. Sinai becomes the mountain of covenant. Zion becomes the mountain of God's kingdom. Mountains frequently represent places where heaven and earth overlap. If that pattern is correct, Mount Hermon becomes a dark counterpart to Sinai and Zion. Instead of covenant faithfulness, it becomes associated with rebellion. Instead of obedience, it becomes associated with boundary violation. Instead of heavenly order, it becomes associated with corruption. But the story does not end there. One of the most fascinating details in the Gospels is that Jesus deliberately travels into regions surrounding Caesarea Philippi, located near Mount Hermon. This was not random geography. Caesarea Philippi was known for pagan worship, shrines dedicated to false gods, and a cave that later traditions associated with the gates of the underworld. Standing in that region, Jesus asks his disciples one of the most important questions in Scripture. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus makes a declaration that has echoed through Christian history. "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Gates are defensive structures. Jesus is not describing his people hiding from darkness. He is describing an advancing kingdom, confronting darkness directly. Now consider that statement in light of Mount Hermon. If ancient traditions connected Hermon to rebellion, and if Jesus intentionally ministers in that territory, the symbolism becomes extraordinary. The faithful son enters territory associated with spiritual rebellion and announces that his kingdom will advance against the powers of darkness. The contrast could not be greater. The watchers abandoned their assignment. Christ fulfills his assignment. The watchers crossed boundaries in rebellion. Christ crosses heaven and earth in obedience. The watchers contributed to corruption. Christ brings restoration. This pattern continues throughout the New Testament. Paul repeatedly speaks about rulers, authorities, powers, and dominions. He does not deny the reality of spiritual powers. Instead, he emphasizes Christ's supremacy over them. Colossians declares that all things were created through Christ and for Christ, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities. The point is not fear. The point is sovereignty. The Bible never presents spiritual powers as equal rivals to God. They are created beings. They are accountable beings. They are judged beings. And ultimately, they are defeated beings. This brings us to the deeper meaning of Mount Hermon. Whether one accepts every detail of later Watcher traditions or not, the mountain functions as a powerful symbol. It represents the moment when created beings attempted to seize authority outside God's order. It represents the temptation that appears repeatedly throughout Scripture: power without obedience, wisdom without submission, authority without faithfulness. That same temptation appears in Eden. It appears at Babel. It appears in Israel's history. It appears in the kingdoms of the world. And it still appears today. Humanity continually seeks autonomy apart from God. We pursue knowledge without wisdom, power without holiness, spirituality without obedience. Yet Scripture consistently warns that these paths lead toward corruption rather than life. The answer is not greater knowledge alone. The answer is transformation through Christ. The biblical story moves from rebellion toward restoration, from corrupted sacred space toward redeemed sacred space, from fallen rulers toward the faithful king. And Revelation completes that story. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven. The nations are healed. The curse is removed. Heaven and earth overlap correctly once again. The rebellion that began in the earliest chapters of Scripture is finally answered by the reign of Christ. So what are the 6 biggest insights from our investigation? First, Mount Hermon became associated with one of the most significant rebellion traditions in ancient Jewish thought. Second, Genesis 6 introduces a supernatural rebellion that shaped how many ancient readers understood the biblical story. Third, biblical geography often carries spiritual significance beyond physical location. Fourth, Scripture presents a cosmic conflict involving nations, rulers, and spiritual powers. Fifth, Jesus deliberately confronts territory associated with darkness and announces his kingdom's victory. Sixth, the entire biblical narrative points toward Christ as the faithful ruler who succeeds where every rebellious power failed. Mount Hermon is not ultimately a story about fallen angels. It is a story about God's victory over rebellion. Because no matter how deep the darkness appears, Scripture consistently points to the same conclusion. The powers are real. The conflict is real. But Christ is greater. The Watchers abandoned their assignment. Humanity failed its calling. Yet God never abandoned his plan. Where rebellion brought corruption, Christ brings restoration. If this investigation challenged what you thought you knew about Mount Hermon and the supernatural worldview of Scripture, leave a comment below. And if you enjoy biblical deep dives grounded in Scripture, subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the world behind the Bible.